Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm here to, my name is Tom Beckett. I'm what's known as the corresponding director for IISS Americas. I may say what that means in a couple of moments, but I'm here to thank all of you for attending. We've got about 30 people in the room, and we might have about 60 odd people online, which is testament to our panelists who are going to be speaking now. I'm not going to introduce them. I'm going to leave that to Benjamin Petrini, who's our research fellow for conflict, security and development, so he'll deal with all that. My job is to thank you for attending either online or here in person. I said I was the corresponding director. What does that mean? It means I split my time between here in DC and our head office in London. And for me, that's great because it means that all the hard work is done by Lee Morris Sloan, who's our managing director, and her wonderful team here, and I can just breeze in and out. The purpose of this event is, as an institute, we're a geopolitics institute, but our DNA is strategic studies, a defense and security think tank. And we have three broad themes of research: war, power, and rules. And within war, we have a number of key publications, one of which is the Armed Conflict Survey. And this event is part of our war theme, and we're referring back to the Armed Conflict Survey. Benjamin is one of the authors of the Armed Conflict Survey and is also the managing editor, and that's why he's hosting this event for you here. So I just wanted to thank you, explain where we situate this event within our research work, and to thank you for attending. So on that note, I'm going to hand you over to
Thank you very much, Tom. Thank you to our panelists, and welcome everyone here in person and online. We are having this conversation today on the increasing scale of humanitarian crisis and the associated needs, as well as the responses to humanitarian needs and their challenges and barriers. But also we want to set a bit wider scope to explore the extent to which these rising humanitarian crises are connected and associated to other phenomena going on today in the world, like the decline in international norms and cooperation, the decreased legitimacy of multilateral institutions and processes, and obviously the escalation of armed conflicts. And this, meaning like armed conflicts, is the subject of the book that we have here, and that we are that this event is around this book. This is the 10th edition, so this is now a mature and established publication for IISS that targets both the community of practice, but also sort of the casual reader interested in international affairs. It is a compendium of all the main armed conflicts and the area of crisis globally, and it includes country chapters, it includes regional overviews tying together the main security issues, and profiles of over 200 conflict parties, including non-state armed groups. It is also enriched by regional country maps on the incidence of conflict, trends in violence, etc. And as these things are always changing, we're already preparing for the next year book edition. Now, I just want to say, before introducing our panelists, a few words to contextualize armed conflicts globally as armed conflicts that are largely driving the humanitarian crisis today and the human suffering. If we take the 7 countries that have the most people, the largest amount of people in need, over 10 million each, all of them are conflict-affected countries. And so understanding, addressing, and solving armed conflicts should be at the forefront of any discussions on humanitarian issues. Currently, the world is witnessing the highest number of armed conflicts since World War II. And according to the Uppsala Conflict Data Program, in 2023, there were 59 state-based armed conflicts globally, which is the highest number since 1946. I talk about Uppsala because it collects data since 1946. 57 of these 59 are intrastate conflicts or civil wars, either with or without external intervention. At the same time, there is an escalating trend of non-state armed groups that has been even more remarkable. In the last decade, between 2014 and 2023, the average number of non-state conflicts, meaning conflicts between non-state armed groups without the participation of the state, has been 76 per year. Now, this average is the double as the average of the preceding 2 decades. But since the number of conflict-affected countries in the last 2 to 3 decades has been more or less stable, this means that each country has more than one conflict at the same time. And so countries experience conflicts that are highly fragmented, and this increases their complexity and the challenges in bringing responses, including humanitarian responses. And also today, non-state armed groups seem to lack a centralized agenda, and most of them are content with the status quo and are not interested in conflict resolution, so they are very hard to bring at the negotiating table. And so conflicts today are more and more protracted as they extend in duration. Now, all this situation has direct implication on the scale of humanitarian crisis and on the responses. And so these are just a few contexts that I think it's needed. Now, let me bring in our panelists. I have the pleasure to introduce from my left to right, Fabrizio Carboni, who is the head of regional delegation to the United States and Canada of the International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC. Thank you, Fabrizio. Brittany Brown, former assistant to the administrator of the Bureau for Conflict Prevention and Stabilization at the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID. Thank you. And Dr. Michael Barnett, University Professor of International Affairs and Political Science at the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. Thank you for joining us. So in terms of format, we'll have a round, some remarks from the speakers to kick us off, and then we'll have a few rounds of exchanges and discussions, followed by Q&A. For those that are joining us virtually, to participate in the discussion and ask a question, please use the Q&A function. You can open the Q&A window, type your question, and I will be able to see it and relate it later on. Now, Fabrizio, let me start with you. ICRC is one of the largest humanitarian organizations globally. You're the repository of international humanitarian law. So from your point of view, what are the main concerns today at the field level? And what is your take on the state of humanitarian crisis and conflicts producing them?
First of all, I think as a starting point, we need to agree that there was never a golden age of either IHL, of the respect of the law of armed conflict, or humanitarian action. And I think it's important to have this common baseline, because, I mean, I'm sure in your respective institution, if you look at your report, every year you're writing that this year is a turning point. It won't be worse than next year, you know. And I think it's important to give a sense of direction, a sense of probably an historical arch. And if you take the Second World War as a starting point, I mean, we're not in a great place, that's for sure. But to say that nothing happened and that things are not moving, I would say it's not accurate. And on top of this, I don't think it helps. So I would use this as really an important starting point. And then from a very, I would say, selfish and ICIC perspective, I mean, every day we need to wake up, go into our cars, visit the prison, go to the front lines, treat wounded, engage authorities, engage non-state actor. If the mindset is, you know, there is no hope, I mean, it's not possible. And by the way, I don't think it's true. I don't want to think it's true. Let's put it like this. So what is very striking for me, it's everything is overwhelming. You know, when I start working 20 years ago, first mission I was in Afghanistan, it was localized. You had the impression, and maybe it was misleading, but you had the impression that you had some grip on what was happening in the area you were covering, in the activities you had. Today, I mean, it's sincerely overwhelming because it's not just the direct impact of the conflict. It's indirect impact. The fact that it's almost all crises are protracted crises. I mean, ICSC average presence in conflict, it's probably in context is probably around 25, 30 years, 40 years. So the very nature of humanitarian action is challenged and questioned. So the climate crisis, I mean, I don't know, whatever you think about why it happens. I mean, I leave it to everybody to decide what are the causes. But something is happening. That's the minimum we can say for the ones who have been, I don't know, in Iraq, have been in Sahel, in many places around the world. Whatever is the reason, something is happening. Moving people, destroying livelihood, and then, yeah, it's this loop effect, and it's non-stop. So as humanitarian actors, I believe that we really need to reassert the fact that we don't solve problems. We don't make peace. We're not a substitute to political action, and not political action, political courage, compromises. We can believe that force will solve all the political problems we face, or the humanitarian crisis we face. Evidence are not showing this. So the other factor, which is also why it's scary, and you'll have to stop me because I can spend the whole afternoon. Okay. You know, our security is based on acceptance. On acceptance and on the fact that people around you, armed actors, civilians, politicians, acknowledge that we are only there for humanitarian reasons and that we want to assist according to needs and that we want to be perceived as neutral. And I insist on to be perceived as neutral because, I mean, neutrality in the US, if I wanted to be neutral in the US is probably not the same thing as being neutral in Yemen. But I need to be perceived as neutral by everybody. And there we're facing a challenge which is not specific to humanitarian actor, is that this non-partisan space is under massive pressure. And I wonder even if sometimes it still exists. And there are different factors. I mean, the first one, it's the one we all know. It's where people go to find information. It's the social media, creating these almost parallel worlds, you know, where you have a totally different narrative. You expose to totally different images. You expose to a totally different view of, for instance, a given conflict. And those communication bubbles coexist. But the problem is there is no space for non-partisan. And by the way, it's not that those bubbles are not true. It's just that we need to reconcile them. I mean, I would take probably something a bit less contentious than what we can see here. You know, I worked a lot in Syria, and there was a narrative on the Sunni side that, you know, there were victims, you know, and that all the Shia community were organizing, structuring themselves to oppress the Sunni community, which was on the verge of survival. And I think the origin of the Islamic State can be also traced to this narrative. On the Shia side, we're saying, look, for centuries, we were the lowest class in this region. We were oppressed. Nobody took care of us. We can only count on us. And those two narratives, they were not wrong. Just that you need to reconcile them. And that's, I think, for us, a major challenge as a humanitarian organization. And then the last point on this one is that the communication sphere was always something, an extension of the battlefield. We know. But, you know, when you look at the means we had in the Second World War or even, you know, 30 or 40 years ago, I mean, it was printing newspapers. Today, states, non-state armed group understood that there are more chances for them to lose war in the communication space than on the battlefield. And we've seen many armies, many states, who never actually lost on the battlefield. They lost in the communication, the influence. The constituency were not following them anymore. They were not accepting anymore the cost of war. And this is fully understood. And so this communication space is an extension of the battlefield. And we are victim of this. And as we don't, you know, confidentiality has its advantages, but also some disadvantages. And one of them is that you can't argue. You know, and it's not about saying, oh, look, this is my opinion, this is the reason. And so the person listening to you say, oh, you're right, I will change my mind. Yes, exactly. So I'll stop there. I think like everything around us, geopolitics, the nation, the alliances, everything is changing. Humanitarian action will have to change or is changing. And if we don't do it ourselves, we will be forced to change.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this. Let me turn to Professor Barnett. According to the UN, in the last 5 years, the number of people in need of humanitarian assistance almost doubled from 168 million in 2020 to 305 million as of December 2024. Can you give us a bit of your view on how and why humanitarian crises have skyrocketed in the last decade or so, and what's your take on this? You should have a mic over there. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me. Been a admirer of IISS for many years, so it's good to finally be present. The first thing I want to say is just reinforce something that was said at the very beginning, which is that humanitarians have a tendency to always see the sky is falling. There's never a good time. There's never a good year. And I understand that because of the business they're in. It's also, you know, a little bit to their advantage to say the sky is falling, because that's actually good for funding. And so it's not to say let's take the numbers with a grain of salt, because they're very real. But rather it's to say that when we talk about crises, we can use those epidemiological models that tell us, you know, whether in fact things are getting better or worse. But most of us have an instinct that looks and sort of gauges, okay, that's an emergency, that's a crisis. The other thing I want to note is that demand has gotten much higher over the last number of years and has not kept up. And I would say demand has gotten higher. One of the things we've seen over the last 2 decades is where the humanitarian system despite all the creakiness and faults, is probably better equipped for response than ever before. And, and that's from a lot of work from the top all the way down. And as an academic who's on the outside, I'm always happy to talk about problems with humanitarianism, but, for a later time. And what I want to emphasize is I don't think I've seen the humanitarian system less equipped to deal with what's ahead. And even if we take a very narrow definition of humanitarianism, which is, situations of urgent need and life-saving responses, there's still, I think, very much a sense in which the system, as they like to say a few years ago, is just not fit for the future. And so things do have to change, but it's difficult for a variety of reasons that many of us know. And I would say, I just need to highlight for a moment what's happened over the last few days, and that's the funding environment. So that's going to cripple certainly response. So there's more demand. It's not enough. And I would also just sort of note that part of the reason why demand has gone up is because a lot of humanitarian agencies have now sort of added to the list of things they're going to respond to. So the new shiny object is climate change, which, we can probably have a very interesting argument as to whether that's something that humanitarian organizations should be involved in. But we've seen a lot of organizations over the last few years get very big, pursue a high growth strategy, including the ICRC. And that's coming back to haunt them as we speak. The crises, as we talk about it, can divide it into two. There are so-called natural crises. We're seeing more and more of them than ever before because of climate change. And also, I should add, because more populations are located in large coastal cities. And so the expectation is that's going to intensify and increase in the future. The other one, and the one that brings us here, is violence, armed conflict. And, to browse the survey is to sort of get just a taste of what's going on. The big change in many ways is that there's been an increase in international armed conflict, in part because it's not as if it disappeared after the end of the Cold War, but rather in relationship to non-international armed conflict, it really declined. And the fact that we've now seen international armed conflict come back, it's very disturbing and quite worrisome. And yet we still have non-international armed conflict, sometimes called new wars, although I always hated that phrase because, referring back to the beginning, there have always been new wars. Those new wars weren't so new. They're kind of the way wars were always fought. But these are wars in which civilians are not just simply collateral damage, they're intended. And there's intentional harm. The causes are in many ways the same as ever. Because we're talking about armed conflict, it has to do with great power competition and intervention. Just think about some of those hot spots over the last number of years. Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria. These are places in which great powers were not just bystanders, but they were actually interveners. And, we see that also with the transnational forces up and down the Sahel, in which variety of armed forces, major powers are now stationed there. And that can either depress or accelerate. People are debating the trends. The thing that, that I have to note as well is that as great powers have gotten involved, they seem to have forgotten the the laws of armed conflict. And that's always been a problem. One of the things that makes great powers great is that they don't have to abide by the rules that everybody else has to play by. But it is quite disturbing. And certainly the number of aid workers who have died in Syria and Gaza is astronomical. We haven't seen these numbers before. And even the kinds of mechanisms that are used to protect aid workers, like deconfliction mechanisms, are increasingly seen as part of the problem, because in fact, it identifies where the aid workers are, and those who don't want to abide by the laws of armed conflict now see this as an easy way in which to target, brutalize humanitarian workers on the ground. The other part that also bears worth noting is the protracted nature of these conflicts. And it's not just simply the conflicts that themselves are protracted, it is that the consequences of these conflicts are protracted, so that most refugees are increasingly now in, camps. We'll just use that euphemism. And they're in camps because the states that used to be able to be, in many ways, possibly a third country outlet, have closed their doors, as we've seen over the last few days, and without any concern for the consequences for their lives. And I think this is likely to happen with greater intensity. For me, the refugee regime was always a regime of containment. That was its purpose. And we see that in, Technicolor these days. It's really not about intention to protect refugees. In many ways, it's designed to keep refugees as far away from our borders as possible. And just to mention a few things that have also taken place on the ground that have made access more difficult than ever. We've talked about the targeting of workers, which has certainly, let's just say, increased the risk. But there's also that shrinking space. And the shrinking space has meant that the capacity for local agencies, civil society organizations, religious institutions to respond has decreased as well and diminished as well. And so that, when we think about the crippling of the response, that's certainly there. We also see states more willing to use bureaucratic rules to deny access of various kinds. So, I know you need a permit, but you're at the wrong window, go down there, and then what begins to happen. And so it's difficult for many to actually get access, and they're on tenterhooks in terms of whether they'll be able to stay. This is an awful period. I mean, it's never a good time. There was no golden age, and there was never a reasonable age for humanitarianism. But I think the capacity of the system to respond in relationship to the needs has never been worse. And I'm quite worried about that. And certainly the shrinking funding, which predates really the Trump administration, has made it more difficult for anticipatory responses, for planning, for pre-positioning. And I'll end here. One of the things that's beginning to happen is on prioritization, triage at the global level. Which emergencies are you going to care about? Are you going to choose those that are in the highest need, or are you going to choose those that, are being televised and are a media spectacle? Which ones are you going to choose? And, I think the possibility, as MSF likes to advertise, is that there will be more forgotten emergencies than ever before. And so I'm looking for, I think, what we're looking at in the future, in the time ahead, is really quite dispiriting. And I think the understandable response by many in the humanitarian system is to try to minimize the damage rather than to themselves, rather than think about how to best protect and assist affected communities on the ground.
Thank you.
I was like,
Thank-
I don't know if I did, but
especially at the end, I think you did. Yeah, yeah.
Yes, no, in the end, and with respect to the end, we will get to the way forward and how we look at the future. But that was a very good anticipation. Brittany, so until very recently, you have had a senior leadership role at USAID under the Biden administration. And at the time, as we have seen, that has been characterized by the increasing crisis. So what is your take? And as we were joking earlier, is a very fresh stock taking for you. What is your take on the state of humanitarian affairs in these last few years? And perhaps also if you want to talk about some of the main policy approaches and responses by the US government. Thank
Yeah,
you.
absolutely. Okay, so I'm going to start putting you all in a time machine and just going back 8 days. It's just a random date I picked, but if we could just go back 8 days, I think just to start, and then we'll all catch up to reality. But 8 days. And so if we could just start there and to talk a little bit about kind of the last 4 years. I think, a lot of numbers came out. The ones that I think are sort of bear repeating are the increases in the number of people in need of humanitarian assistance. And yes, I think you're 100% right that it's always a turning point. This is always the worst moment in time. I think of any of us who, been in DC for a while, you'll know it's always the worst time. And I think to the idea of there's, growing numbers of people who are always in, acute need of food assistance. It is always the worst case scenario. And it's kind of what's great about humanitarian actors, right? Is they care that much that they're, we're going to make sure that people know that in some places the sky really is falling. So these numbers, we think about 2022 and I think, 274 million people, 200, then we go to 2023 and we have 300 and however many million people. Then 2024, another 300 million people, all of them in need of emergency humanitarian assistance and protection. I mean, that is massive numbers of people. And so my last 4 years in the Conflict Prevention and Stabilization Bureau was really thinking about how are we stopping the bleeding, right? How are we stopping those numbers from continuing? Because we know that as these conflicts all grow, and we can read in this report that as all the conflicts grow, these numbers are just going to continue to go up. And if we don't find a way to stop that, we are not going to be able to keep up. The system is not going to be able to absorb 500 million people in acute need of food assistance. We are not going to be able to respond in a way that we are proud of, or in a way that actually feels like we should be doing for humanity. So we really need to be talking about those sort of the upstream. How are we ending conflict? How are we thinking about these interstate conflicts? And so there was a lot of ways that we tried to do this. I think some of the things that I am most proud of is, there's actually a lot of people in this room who led the way 20 years ago, and maybe even longer, but I've been tracking for about 20 years around the humanitarian development peace nexus, right? The HDP nexus. And we spent a heck of a lot of time over the last 20 years, and a lot of you wrote paper after paper about how we were going to do this differently, how we were going to actually think about how do the humanitarian actors connect to the long-term development folks? How do the peace builders connect to the development folks? Yeah, we still haven't figured that out. We tried really hard in this administration to re-crack the nut again. We dusted off all your old papers. We opened it all up again. We asked, what lessons can we learn from Afghanistan and Iraq? What lessons can we learn from what's happening anywhere? Sudan, Ethiopia, Somalia. What are the best things that we can do? At USAID specifically, we picked some pilot countries and tried to break down funding barrier walls so we could think about how do we have policies that aren't limited by, oh, this is HA and this is development and this is peacekeeping. Again, have not cracked that nut. Like there's an assignment for all of you as we go forward. It's to continue to try and think about how we do that. Maybe it's renaming it so people don't have to hear the word nexus and get discouraged again. But I think there is something to be said about this new world that we're living in. And as these numbers go up and these conflicts keep growing, how are we going to continue to think about how we do this differently? Because 100% the system can't handle it. Other ways that we tried to do this is, and I think some of the implementing partners felt this right on is, we return to sort of the localization question. How do we continue to have HA and development have a local bent in a way that is so important? Like, how are we listening to the people about what they want? One of my favorite stories from one of the offices that I worked with was related to Libya and CERT. And, don't quote me on the exact number, so I'll do my best here. When you're not in the government anymore, you don't have someone telling you all the numbers of what the percentage were of things. But so we rewind to CERT, controlled by ISIS, strongest ISIS hold outside of Syria. And the US government and other folks decide we're going to, go in with some pretty heavy responses, some pretty targeted strikes on CERT. So we tell everyone, get out of CERT. If you are not ISIS, leave. People leave. We saw hundreds of thousands of people leave, into the millions of people leaving CERT and going and setting up camp outside of CERT. The US government and the coalition goes in and bombs CERT like crazy. ISIS is gone. USAID funds a program to go in and try and figure out how do we get these refugees, how do we get these IDPs back into CERT? So what's the best way to do that? We go to the camps. We go to the IDPs and we say, what will it take for you to move back home? Like, what do you actually need? We didn't decide sitting here in Washington, D.C. that the best thing that they needed was like education programs or a health program. We actually went to the camps and talked to people and said, what do you need? And so we go in there, we interview all these people, and then we go and we say they need things like they want their garbage to be picked up. They want rubble. They want working water systems. They want their roads to be clear so that the economic systems that they already have can kick off and can work. And so we listened to them, and we spent $18 million, which to USAID sometimes is a lot of money. When you look at the trillions of dollars we spent, 18 million is nothing. And you know what we saw? 97% of the CERT residents returned to CERT. Like, listen to that. When we think about how many people are all over the world living in camps, we just listen to the people. And it sounds really obvious, but boy, do we not do this. And so we took that lesson, a lesson from CERT, and we thought about how do we continue to do this? That's a perfect example of this HDP nexus, or this nexus of how are we going to build on these humanitarian crises. We listened to the people in Al Hol in Syria and asked them, what would it take for you to return home? Do you want to return home? We aren't going to force you to do anything. One of the tenets of humanitarian assistance, we're not going to force you to go, but what would it take for you actually to return home? A couple garbage trucks, you got it. Like some ambulances, working with people like the White Helmets, who were actually able to go in and ask people, what do you need to return? So we tried this at USAID. We've done this before, but tried it again. How do we listen to local actors? We discovered some pretty hard truths that I think probably some people in this room would have been like, duh. But you realize that when you're trying to spend $10 billion in humanitarian assistance to save lives, it's pretty hard to do that through local organizations. Because an outfit that has 4 people, or when we started with the White Helmets, 2 people, they're not going to be able to absorb $1 billion in humanitarian assistance. The emergency response folks in Sudan, like they're not going to be able to, to absorb $1 billion of U.S. assistance that's going into Sudan. These are like just normal people who want to make a difference. And then, right, we have Congress overlaying all of this. So Congress making sure that there's no waste, fraud, and abuse, making sure that we're monitoring and evaluating the things that we're doing, making sure that we're checking up on things. Local organizations can't do that. So we were able to do a little bit more, right, at USAID to try and increase the amount of humanitarian assistance and the amount of development assistance that's going into local actors. I'm proud of a lot of that work because we listen to people. At no point is USAID or our humanitarian assistance ever going to be targeted to only local organizations. We need the big organizations because they're the ones who can absorb huge amounts of money and can respond really quickly at high levels. But we're going to keep trying that. One of the other things that we worked really hard to implement was actually, it was a Trump administration initiative called the GFA, Global Fragility Act. Again, Global Fragility Act looked at humanitarian assistance and said, how are we going to do development differently so that we don't end up with 500 million people on that list? So that 300 and whatever it is right now of people that need assistance doesn't go up, but instead starts to go down. We still have a way to go. The Global Fragility Act, when I would meet with donors, they would say, we're so jealous the United States government has legislation that requires you to think about fragility, to think about stemming the tide of humanitarian disasters, to actually try and stop it. We have a long way to go. But these are some of the things that we really tried to kick off in the previous administration. The other thing we did is we really tried to push that system to ask those really hard questions. Again, like, when you sit on the outside, you look and you're like, kind of like, why are these people not doing more? And I will tell you, I sat there and watched these thousands of USAID bureaucrats, many of who are now on leave. They were doing incredible, creative, amazing things to try and push things. It's hard to say that we were successful yet, but I still believe this sort of mentality, especially the Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance at USAID, is filled with these people, these optimists, just like you, who are like so hopeful that we can do this better and we can do it differently. And you saw that President Biden actually gave the permission for us to do it differently. And, I think to the idea of when should we be in crises and when should we not? I think Ukraine is a great example. Like, of course, Russia invades Ukraine immediately. The humanitarian actors are there. But you know what? They weren't there very long. Instead, it was offices like the Office of Transition Initiatives, the Conflict Stabilization Operations, all of these other folks that are good at doing development in times of war could come in. And the humanitarian assistance folks could step out at least a little bit, at least on the life-saving stuff, because Ukraine didn't need that. You know who needed it? Sudan. That's who we need to be paying attention to. If we had had a little more time, one of the areas where I saw us going was asking really hard questions about places where we have spent gazillions of dollars. I think we all think about South Sudan, at least I do. I think about it a lot. I don't know what the numbers are today, but it's probably more than $15 billion. 15 billion have gone into South Sudan, and things are not any better than they were when we spent that first dollar as a US government. So that is something that we were ready to start challenging ourselves on how are we thinking about how our humanitarian assistance is not neutral, and in fact is propping up different regimes that do not have any interest in ending the conflicts that are happening, do not have any interest in stopping the need for Band-Aids or for humanitarian assistance, this life-saving stuff. Okay, so step out of the time machine. Here we are today. I think everybody is probably as glued to their phones as I am about the news of all the different things that have happened. I don't think I'm over exaggerating when I say the stoppage by the Trump administration of US foreign assistance is devastating. I think, again, you're all seeing the same news that I am, that this means that unless it is food assistance, it does not have a waiver to continue. And so I think, again, there are people who know a lot more about this, but we do a heck of a lot more as a community than food assistance, whether it's clean water, whether it's medical stuff, whatever. I mean, a lot of you are the experts in this, but all of that stuff is now on hold. We're hearing stories of even some of the food assistance is not being allowed to be delivered. We have local staff that are all being laid off and furloughed while this review happens. Our instinct, any of us, the instinct is foreign assistance and humanitarian assistance needs a review. There's no question the system is not working. There is no question it is broken. There is no question we need to think really hard about this. I think anybody who's ever done something like this could say, though, that a full stoppage is not the way that you fix these things. Because what happens to those 40,000 Kenyans who are now unemployed? What happens to all those people who are on antiviral drugs? What happens to the babies who do not have plumpy nut? What happens to those people over the next 90 days? And anybody who thinks this review is only going for 90 days, I think you have another thing coming, because this review is going to go a lot longer than 90 days. When we are being asked as a community to report on sub-obligations in the tens of hundreds of thousands, we are seeing millions of different sub-obligations that are going to need to be reported. So right now, the crisis that I think we would have talked about, that I was thinking about 8 days ago, it is so much more acute now. And I think the thing that I'll close on is funding is always important. Like, we know that the most important policy document in Washington, D.C. is our appropriation. That is the most important, like the president's budget followed by congressional appropriation. Those are the two most important policy documents that Washington, D.C. puts out. Forget the national security strategy. It is, where are we putting our money? That is what actually shows what we care about and what we are going to do, and where does Congress want our money? So that is like a major piece that we need to be thinking about as we are seeing this stoppage of money that was appropriated by the United States Congress to be spent on certain things is now not happening. So what does that mean? And then I think the last piece of this that has really stuck with me and was very tricky over the last 4 years is this access question. So we can talk a lot about money, but if we go in our time machine to 8 days ago, I would have talked a lot more about access, because in some ways I think we have plenty of money. It is, we don't have access anymore, because suddenly we do see governments being much more willing to play with visas for humanitarian workers, to play with, I'm sorry, you're at the wrong window. You signed this in blue ink instead of black ink. Like, we really were finding that they were getting very good at using humanitarian assistance as a weapon of war, and as something that really, like, that they were perfectly fine with seeing their people starve. And as we all know, a core tenement of any sort of, development or foreign assistance is, you can't want it more than the people you're trying to work with. And so I will end there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'd like to ask a follow-up question that is about some of the way forward, what we see coming. Obviously, some of you have already anticipated that, but let me start with Fabrizio, and what are some of the current barriers that you see for humanitarian actors and humanitarian organizations, and how to overcome them, and so some of the challenges at the operational level. And I'm thinking analytically, something that I mentioned earlier, of how complicated is the process of negotiating with several non-state armed groups, more than when insurgencies were much more cohesive.
I think humanitarian access and funding, these are consequences of whether or not you manage to build trust, and whether or not a state feel that it has a stake or some skin in your organization. If we look at the funding, we can speak about the US. But I think if we take a bigger picture, I mean, I'm talking about the ICRC. Who is funding the ICRC? Western states, Japan, South Korea, marginally Gulf states? Where is China? Where is India? And this is not a money issue. And the challenge is for us, it's not for them. It's not the problem of China, it's my problem. To build a relationship with those states where we make them feel that they have a stake in what we do, that they have skin in the ICRC work. And there comes a couple of things which are related to humanitarian access, because humanitarian access, we want unrestricted humanitarian access. And we want to be independent. I mean, if you put yourself in the shoes of some of those states, who, by the way, most of them were colonized, how does it sound? It doesn't sound great, I can tell you. It actually doesn't fly at all. And so we need to find a way, and I think that's when we are successful, to demonstrate that humanitarian action, as we understand it, and here I'm talking about the ICRC, I'm not talking about other organizations, is actually in the best interest of everybody. And even if you don't look at this from a humanitarian angle, you look at it from a stability, a reconstruction angle, a political angle, we should be in a position to make the case that actually what we're doing is not in tension with this. Because I don't think there is a way out. I really, today, what do we have at the horizon? Famous large-scale confrontation, and I hope it will never happen, between China and the US. What does it mean for us humanitarian actors? How are we going to be relevant? And I'm talking again, ICRC, visiting prisoners of war, maritime conflict, because it will be mainly fought on the oceans. So I really think that it won't be enough to keep on repeating the same thing and hoping that the one in front of us will suddenly see something else than just in their view. And I'm not saying they are right, but that's how they see it. A form of, oh God, I'm not going to make friends tonight, neo-colonial approach, imperialism. I'm not saying it's right. I'm just saying that we cannot ignore this. I mean, look at West Africa. They reach a point where they prefer to damage themselves, and they know it, than actually acknowledge that they need international humanitarian support or international support in general. So I really think it won't be enough to repeat the same mantra over and over and over. Here it's about building trust, knowing that we are not in our house, that we are in the house of somebody else. And I think funding and access, it's connected to some extent around this issue of trust. Then, let's be honest, also, people, there are some conflicts where the objective is not only to win the war, it's also to inflict pain. And there is a belief that the more pain you inflict to somebody, there is a dimension of revenge. There is a dimension of pain. And it's really, to some extent, depressing because it's history repeating. We know it doesn't. If you want to achieve your military objective, we fully know that vengeance, inflicting pain for just the sake of inflicting pain doesn't work. We know it. But every 10 years, you have conflicts where you cannot ignore this revenge dimension, this dimension where you want to inflict pain, whatever it happens. And there, I don't know if it's more a psychology issue, it's more something around the nature of humans. I really I sometimes feel that the tools I have, the legal tools I have, the operational tools I have, are not useful for the challenge I'm facing. Because in front of us, we have people with their own irrationality, with their own fear, believing that they often are in a survival mode. And it's this dimension which I believe is not captured enough, the fact that we are not rational operators, that there are emotions, that there are fear. So don't ask me how, but I think acknowledging this is a good start.
Thank you. Thank you. Now you bring these points that go well beyond the humanitarian level and really thinking about the international relations and re-equilibrating imbalances, and so issues of dignity, voice, and agency for and equity. Michael, what's your take on this? And I saw you nodding and points and.
Gosh. I guess just to respond a little bit and keep that conversation going. There is a big problem with access, and I actually, And access isn't necessarily from the standpoint of combatants a good thing, which is why, of course, they frustrated and they set up barriers and obstacles and detour signs. And it's because you do want to inflict pain. I mean, that's the point, is to inflict enough pain to the point that the other side surrenders, has had enough. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. Yeah. So, you know, access then has political effects. It's not that it's politically motivated, but the effects are political. And as long as the effects are political, you're going to want to see states and donors instrumentalize it in various ways. And we're in that age, and it's always been that way. But it feels like states have become more sophisticated in how they're doing it. The second point is, and this is where everybody's eyes glaze over, is that there's no system of accountability. There's no cost to any of these actors that are involved in committing war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and other forms of inflicted pain that are below that level. I mean, there really isn't, and the accountability tends to go to those who are the weakest, and you know, which is why, of course, there are so many complaints that, you know, those who are in the Central African Republic can be swooped up, but don't touch the Israelis. And so, you know, you have what are viewed as two systems of justice. You know, that's the perception, as opposed to that's a reasonable grasp of reality. But, you know, what we've seen is that there's really very little accountability, and especially for those who can do the most damage. You know, for those old enough, I remember when Colin Powell warned President Bush about Iraq. You break it, you buy it. And I thought, oh my God, what a ridiculous statement. The whole point of being a great power is you can break it and then walk away, which is kind of, you know, that's what great powers do. So there's no real accountability. I think the other thing that's going to happen, and I guess I want to make my own position clear on this, is that humanitarianism is not really an answer to much. It's not going to be an answer to those root causes that we talk about. It's not going to be an answer, in my judgment, to development. That's not what humanitarians can do well. I think it's sort of outside their wheelhouse. And I think asking them to do that, or them demanding that they also have a role to play is too much. And I imagine that one of the things that's going to happen going forward in this new age of austerity is that people are going to have to, as they say, go back to basics. In some way, you have to make priorities about what really matters and what your core mission is, because you can no longer do everything. And we're seeing the big agencies making those choices now. They are cutting staff, they're shedding. And so you know, for me, the need to, if you will, return, you know, in some ways, I'll just confess that everything I learned early on about humanitarianism, I did at the feet of the ICRC and MSF, Doctors Without Borders. And so I was indoctrinated to their way of thinking about humanitarianism. And, you know, and I appreciated the fact that our concepts, our isms can expand, can curtail, can change. But there is this sense in which I think there's going to have to be a return, a more modest humanitarianism. And I guess the last point I'll make is on localization, which you touched on. And I have my own personal doubts about whether localization will bring the benefits that it's expected to. I think there's reasons, as you were saying, that localization can't do everything and local actors. But then again, you know, there's, I think, enough reasonable evidence to show that local actors can be much more efficient. Again, I think depending on the circumstances, much more efficient, much more effective. They are willing to stay oftentimes when others are you know, are fleeing to a neighboring capital and are engaged in remote control humanitarianism. So I think that this could be a moment then where local actors, which are being cut off at the knees as we speak, are going to find that that it actually provides maybe a source for their own creativity and where they should go. And I should just, you know, one last point. I was at a meeting several months ago in Thailand with a lot of Southeast Asian NGOs. And I was, you know, and one of the questions I put before them was, you know, in the same way that the big international agencies are trying to find new pots of money, which is why you see so many of them cozy up to large corporations, because that's where the money is. And they're trying to do the same. And I think they're going to have to find new pots, unusual pots, if they're going to be able to continue to do their job. And so I do imagine that there is going to be, and the trends are showing a shift towards more local action, and not just local action, but local authorities. And that may be, I think, one of the ways going forward, that the international can't do everything, nor should it. And we may see, I think, some positive change there.
Thank you very much. Brittany, you alluded already at complementarity, the HTP, and yes, something on localization. Do you have anything to react on what the other said, and briefly, and then we can go into the room for Q&A.
Okay, I think a few things that I wanted to comment on. One, you know, this idea of what this age of austerity. I mean, I think this is back to sort of what we've said. There's never been enough money. I mean, I don't know, it never been enough money. I don't even think, right, the Department of Defense in the US has $1 trillion budget and they don't think they have enough money, right? Like this is maybe human nature, but you know, they don't think that they have enough. And we are, I mean, the US government, right, it's less than 1% of our budget goes to development and foreign assistance, humanitarian assistance. So it's a tiny amount of money. Of course, it's not enough, but it is our new reality. And so I think to build a little bit off this idea of like, I think there is a benefit to tighter budgets, right? It does focus us. It helps us to really ask the hard questions about where is our return on investment? Where are we actually seeing successes in what we're doing? It can be paralyzing. And I think that would be my argument for what has happened over the last few days. This sort of blunt force approach to rethinking about these things doesn't lead people to creative thinking around how are we going to do more or different with less. It leads to paralyzation of hopelessness and inability to even find a way out. When I think the reality is there is, you know, we can use technology, we can use just like everything that is happening in the world to think about how humanitarian assistance could be different. I had planned, again, 8 days ago, to spend the next 4 years thinking about these kinds of questions with all of you and with other people, to think about how can we do humanitarian assistance differently, knowing that these numbers keep going up and conflicts keep increasing. So I think like we have to keep challenging ourselves of smaller budgets are not always bad. And I don't know if the answer is to return to basics, because maybe there never was a golden age of basics to return to. It really is to think of whether it's people are talking about a new way of war, well, let's be a new way of humanitarian assistance, right? Let's, you know, if it really is not actually that new. It's just like, how are we evolving as, you know, humanitarians that care about these things in this new world with less money, because there will be less money. And what that really goes to is how are we supporting, conflict mitigation, you know, all of the proxy wars that are happening. How are we calling them out? How are we holding great powers accountable? Do I get to not be a great power anymore because I'm not in the administration? I think, you know, how are we holding ourselves accountable and others accountable for their engagement? And I think the one that I spent the most time on over the last 4 years was Sudan. Like, how are we thinking about this war that, I mean, you know, someone from your team, and one of the things I was listening to called it, you know, they were like, it's really important we do not think of Sudan as a civil war. And I think that is so important. Sudan is not a civil war. It is a war between two belligerents. That is what this is. The people, it's against the people of Sudan. It is two belligerents fighting the people of Sudan. And that is so important that we think about. And they're doing this with the weapons and the money and the support of outside actors. So how are we thinking about calling that out and holding all of these folks accountable? And I mean, I think that's what's up to all of us. And then I think this idea of like the, you know, private sector resources are going to save us all. I really, you know, I have a lot of doubts. And it also, that's not the world that I want to live in. Like, I don't want to live in a world where the US administration, right? I don't know what the numbers are for you guys specifically, but right, all the reports say that we provide 75%. The US government provides 75% of humanitarian assistance funds. 75%. So if you imagine that we are going to zero that out or cut that in half, I don't want some tech billionaire to come in and fill that gap. I'm not interested in seeing the richest man in the world put $6 billion into humanitarian assistance, because we see what happens. You think colonialization is bad, right? Like, it's going to be very different when suddenly there is that, you know, the tech element or any sort of billionaire element of it. They are very important in our philanthropic world, but I am a true believer in government, and I want our governments to take responsibility for this, and for taking the responsibility to try and figure out how we can do good in the world.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We can take some questions from the audience. Yes, and if you can quickly introduce yourself. Thank you.
Hi, thank you to all the panelists. That was really interesting. My name is Sarah. I have a slightly controversial question, but I think it's really important given the accountability issue that you raised. So who is going to hold anyone to account? Because, for instance, one of the belligerent actors, well, one of the arms suppliers to the belligerent actors was made a special defense partner of the US in September of last year. We are ostensibly, or were, a values-based government. The UN is where the UN is at the moment. Where does that accountability come from? If on the one side of our mouths, we are tracking arms shipments and saying you are absolutely trafficking arms through Chad to Sudan, and then on the other hand, we're lauding them for defense and security, I mean, this is complete hypocrisy. So, you know, I'm not putting you on the spot, but how do we think about accountability? Who brings the accountability? Who are the grownups in the room anymore? Who listens to anyone? And how do we rein back in the rules-based system so that actually people respect at least some of the rules?
Thank you, Sarah. Any other question we can take? Yes, please.
So going to what she just added on, you know, I think as we look forward in the next 4 years, I think we also have to take a step back and look at how did we get here in the last 4 years? You know, the last 4 years was not successful. We've entered into more conflicts. More people died in Ukraine and Russia. We've had a lot more death in the last 4 years than we had in the previous 4 years. So, you know, when we look at it, we have to look in the mirror and say, what did the last 4 years really do to get us to where we're at? And, you know, we can't just blame the next 4 years that are coming. We have to look back and say, what is Sullivan, McGurk, Barbara Leaf? What did these people who were dictating, Blinken, dictating our policy, what did they do wrong? And the taxpayer in this issue of funding humanitarian relief, I think the taxpayer in the US is really fed up with government spending their money
in the way that they feel is best. It's not government to spend our money. It's the taxpayer actually has a right to dictate where should they be investing humanitarian relief in the future. So my question to you is, how do you look back and use the next 4 years of your career to actually call out where were the mistakes and how do we address those to fix going forward? I call it COEs, it's correction of errors. And those correction of errors are hard to sometimes digest, and maybe that will help our future go forward in a more positive way.
Thank you. We get one last question.
Thank you. This has been fascinating and extremely helpful. I'm Natalie. I'm with CFR. I want to zoom in on the Congo briefly, just because it has been all I've been thinking about for the last 48 hours or more. So talking about creative thinking, if the answer to a massively cut aid budget is to go upstream and to get creative about mitigation, under the Biden administration, as you know, it was the ODNI's office that was talking through and monitoring that ceasefire. It has broken, obviously. Not to be, I mean, this has already been, unfortunately, a bit depressing, not to make it worse. If we are not doing creative thinking upstream on conflict, we are not funding aid to the, millions of people who are already IDPs who have just been displaced again from Kivu. As a government, what is the role, if you have ideas on, of civil society outside of the humanitarian space, think tanks, researchers, academics, is there a collaboration that can exist between that side of the process and the humanitarian organizations? If we are forced to cut out the middleman, if they are doing neither mitigation nor adaptation, that can actually help, right? Is there a way to make policy work with humanitarian orgs, even if that policy isn't coming from the top down? I don't know if it's an answerable question, but it's something I wanted to think about.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We will go in a reverse order. I'll ask you to be brief, to stand to 2-3 minutes. Brittany first.
Okay.
Thank you.
These are really easy to answer quickly. I think on the UAE, Sudan weapons, it's a perfect question. I think that if any of us who are students of U.S. government, we will know that U.S. government policy is filled with hypocrisy. And the places where we actually get ourselves into trouble, and I think we all saw this over the last 4 years, was when we attempted to have a policy that wasn't hypocritical. And that is impossible because every country is different and every conflict is different and our response is different everywhere. And I will say we tied ourselves in massive knots over the last 4 years trying to be purists around, well, if we say this there, then we can't say that there. And what about this there and this there? Unfortunately, there are a lot of different interests in each of these places. And so we tried to walk a really difficult line. And I think on Sudan, the last week of the administration saw some real progress on the ability to be willing to take a risk and declare a genocide where we saw genocide, to declare sanctions on people who needed to be sanctioned, specifically on Sudan. And that is hard to do. It's hard to do at the end of administrations. We thought really long and hard about how to set the Trump administration up so that they could have the most leverage possible to be helpful with the conflict of Sudan. That was the mentality of the last 10 days of the Biden administration on Sudan. How do we set the new team up, knowing all of Trump's strengths around getting people to the table? All of the things that he actually is able to do because he's a little more unpredictable and doesn't necessarily follow all of the same rules that we held ourselves to in the Biden administration. How could we set him up? And this was specifically with sanctions. And so I will say, I wish that we had a policy that was not filled with contradictions, but it is. And I think it will forever be. And then I would say about the taxpayers being tired of the foreign assistance. I think the taxpayers are looking in the wrong place if they're looking at the less than 1% of USAID's budget. And I would also argue is the taxpayers had a say when Congress, who holds the purse, Article 1 of the Constitution, Congress decided how this money was going to be spent. And if you want to see micromanagement, look at how Congress micromanages USAID funding. I don't know what the percentage now, but it's like 95% of USAID's budget is earmarked before it even gets to USAID. And then the White House puts the earmarks on it, like even more. So we had places like in Africa at different points, it was 102% earmarked. How does that even make sense? And so I think the taxpayers do have a say in this, and Congress has actually been very, very involved. Every single penny we spend from USAID had to be approved by Congress. They are notified about everything, which crises we're getting involved in. They are very, very involved. I would actually argue the solution is to have less micromanagement by Congress and give some of those amazing professionals in the HA space and in the development space, the liberty to actually be able to spend their money in the way that they see the context is needed. You know, like people decide 3 years out that we're going to have a health program. And then it doesn't actually matter if there's a global pandemic because suddenly we're still doing a health program. Okay, I'll be really quick. The last one, Congo, I think, you know, the creative thinking was having the ODNI do the ceasefire. Like that is exactly where the creative thinking was coming from. We were trying to think about what can we do with DRC that we haven't ever done before. Let's try something different. Let's get different people involved. Maybe they'll like Avril Haines better than they liked other people. Whatever it is, that kind of creative thinking, I think is actually what the Trump administration is known for. And so when we try and think about where there is optimism in the next few years, there is space for us to be really creative about these different crises and how the new team coming in is not shackled by rule of law or historical ways of doing things. They can do whatever they would like now because they have a president who is not held to those same things that you know, many of us in this room and me specifically hold myself to when it comes to accountability or rule of law, those things. They can just do what they think is right, as we saw with Colombia or anything else over the last 8 days.
And I guess I want to make sure I understood you correctly. And that's a good thing?
No, I mean, it's our reality. So, I mean, like, we can think good or bad. I spent 7 months in the Trump White House. Oh yeah, but I will say, you can think of it as good or bad. It is where we are. So we need to be pragmatic and understand, like, we can wring our hands left and right about this. But at the end of the day, like, this is who we have as our president. This is who 49.6% of Americans voted for. And so we need to say, like, okay, this is our world. How do we find a way to take advantage of those strengths? And if we can't, I mean, then it is our job, right, to do something different. But I think that it is our reality.
Okay, I'm not sure where to go with that. Just a couple of things though on this. Yes, the world is complex. We know that. All the conflicts are complex. They're all complicated. And yes, one of the difficult things when you set up rules that this is the way we should do things is that you're always going to find exceptions to the rules. And you're always going to find reasons to bend the rules. And that's kind of, I get people in power don't want to be beholden to rules. They want their interests. If their interests in the rules conflict, well, then get me another lawyer, you know, that can tell me how the rules actually do apply. I think it's, you know, while I accept that world's complex and people are hypocrites, this is a problem. I mean, it really is. And, you know, one of the ways to get out of it, and there's no easy answer, is now that language of guardrails. You know, is there a way in which those who break the rules can be reminded that there could be costs? So the US is not, you know, what happened in Yemen. I mean, we did have Congress try to get involved and, you know, curtail the weapons shipments. What we saw under Gaza with Biden, where it's clear, as I understand it, from a State Department internal report, that weapons shipments should not have been going to Israel, given the rules that were set up. Now, you know, some noise was made, and that's a good thing, but it certainly puts you in a better position then to be able to then say the rules apply to me and they also apply to you. And so if you want a policy that sets up rules and then ignores them, you're not really in a great position to then hold other people accountable to these rules. And let's just give up the idea of ethics, moral stances, consistent rules. We can do that. And maybe that provides the opportunity to be creative. I don't know. But this is, I worry about creativity in the other direction, quite honestly. That's the part that worries me. I think, just briefly in terms of the Congo, one of the, and this is probably part of the creativity. I mean, there are a couple of things. One is no one wants to hold Rwanda accountable. It has just gotten this get out of jail free card because of 1994 and the genocide. And so that's a problem. And the other is the failure to engage and involve local communities in solutions to the conflict. Most of these, agreements are brokered by those in the capital city or elsewhere, Kinshasa, without really looking at the underlying roots of the conflict and trying to figure out what's the best way to actually begin to provide solutions. And we do see that when you've got local stakeholders involved, it actually does contribute to a peace or mitigation that's more long lasting than when it's something that's set up from the top. So now whether these locally brokered agreements can live in a sea of violence is a really important question. But, I think the imagination needs to take place at all levels, including from the ground up, where the people actually have to live with the consequences. And, and those from the internationals can walk away because they don't live with the consequences. So I do think that, I guess, having a different set of principles would be a good start. It's not, there is no magic bullet out there. And, but I think there are better ways and there are worse ways.
Thank you very much. Fabrizio, one last synthetic comment to any of the questions that you've heard.
Comment about, look, I think when we speak about accountability, we sometimes probably do, we have a confusion, accountability at the domestic level, accountability in international relations. I think you alluded to it. I mean, there's a power relationship. It's intergovernmental relationship. And as ICIC, obviously, we contributed a lot to the International Criminal Court. We support local justice capacity. But if there is no political will, at the end of the day, even the respect of the law of armed conflict, it's a political decision. And we saw it over the last years, because now I disagree when we say that states ignore the law of armed conflict. Actually, I think it's totally the contrary. I think they know very well. I think I've never, when I see the engagement I have over the last years with many, representatives of countries, they know what is the law of armed conflict, but they're not ready to pay the price. There is a political cost, especially when you portray your war as a war of survival. To show mercy has a political cost. Let's talk about Islamic states. Let's talk about the kids in Al-Ol. I mean, we all portray those people as being beyond humanity. Newspapers, I'm sure I'll find also in think tank description of people in a way where you say, God. I mean, even after the Second World War, Nazi had, they were judged, there was trial, there were we acknowledge their humanity despite what they did. But here, the way we understand war, the way we portray conflict, the way we portray the enemy, makes it really difficult to show mercy. You know, to show this, I hate to speak about humanity, but this basic stuff. And so for 10 years or more, you had all the European states, US, going to the Human Rights Council of what it was, and children are victims in conflict, and you lecture Sierra Leone, and you lecture Liberia about their child soldiers. Please treat them first as victims and then as soldiers. But then it's up to us to apply this. And then we say, oh, the famous humanitarian exceptionalism. Yeah, but here it's different. You know, that really mean. So I think I have no answer to the accountability issue because it's about geopolitics. It's about power dynamic. For sure, what we can all do is to stop portraying our enemy as being beyond humanity. Unfortunately, I don't see the beginning of this. And every time a conflict or a crisis starts in the protracted crisis, and it's always the same. And we are back to the same, you know, narrative, which prevents, in my view, a more human and reasonable way of dealing with this. Finally, when we have to speak about accountability, is that we failed already. We need to talk about prevention. I mean, my experience with armed forces, I mean, it's probably one of the most, you know, you need sometimes rewards, you know, you need sometimes things which makes you believe that there is hope. And often, and you'll be surprised, is when you work with soldiers, when you work with officers, when we work with combatants who actually know what it is to be there. And we can't just tell them, you know, humanity, love people. That doesn't work with them. So you need to go into the details of things. You need to speak about, you know, military operation, targeting, how you organize yourself. So I believe we should invest way more energy, time, political capital on preventing instead of running after today, unfortunately, an elusive general accountability.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Apologies to our audience online for not taking their questions. And thank you very much all for coming. Thank you to our speakers. It was a great session. Thank you.